Imagine ancient tablets etched in clay over 5,000 years ago, describing beings who came from the sky, brought knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering, and guided humanity's destiny. Not myths whispered in caves, but structured records preserved in cuneiform. Speaking of entities called the Anunnaki, they didn't just observe, they taught, they ruled. They left blueprints of knowledge we still can't fully understand. The Sumerians, the world's first known civilization, didn't claim to invent this wisdom. They said it was given. So who were these sky gods? Were they deities, metaphors, or something else entirely? The truth may be more incredible than fiction, and the evidence is older than our oldest books. Let's unravel the forgotten truth buried beneath the sands of Sumer. In the blistering heat of southern Iraq, archaeologists unearthed thousands of clay tablets, dusty, cracked, etched with wedge-shaped lines. Most were dismissed as ancient trade records, but buried among them were texts that made even the most seasoned scholars pause. These weren't receipts or inventories. These were histories, detailed, deliberate, disturbingly precise. The tablets came from Sumer, one of the world's oldest civilizations. The language, cuneiform. The content, something entirely unexpected. Descriptions of powerful beings called the Anunnaki, who descended from the heavens. They didn't ask for worship. They gave orders. They passed laws. They taught humans how to farm, build, measure, and rule. It's all there. Not in poetry, in ledgers, in treaties, in city plans. The Sumerians wrote about the heavens not as a mystical realm, but as a place of origin. They called it the Anu domain, home of the sky gods. They described detailed hierarchies, not mythic chaos, structure, protocol, assignments. One tablet from Eridu explains how specific Anunnaki were assigned to specific cities, each with tasks and domains: agriculture, healing, metallurgy. Another outlines star charts and calendar systems attributed not to human study, but to instruction, given, not discovered. These aren't scattered stories. They form a consistent pattern across time and city-states, from Ur to Nippur. The same names, the same claims, the same assertion. Humanity did not rise alone. It was shaped, overseen, possibly engineered. Now pause. What kind of civilization invents gods with administrative job titles? Why describe deities as urban planners or mathematicians? The Sumerians documented divine interventions like we'd record a business merger. Specific dates, specific roles. No thunderbolts, no fire from the sky, just protocol. These weren't myths. They were minutes. Translated by teams of scholars over decades, these tablets weren't hidden. They were archived, cataloged in museums. But because their content didn't fit our framework, they were quietly labeled as symbolic, convenient. But there's one problem. The knowledge they contained is real. Mainstream historians often respond with one word: mythology. They argue that the Anunnaki are fictional gods, created to explain natural forces or reinforce political power. A common explanation, a safe one. But these tablets are not poetic allegories. They don't read like fables. They read like logs, observations, records, systematic instructions. Some even contain what appear to be technical diagrams, calendars, geometry, celestial measurements, all carved into clay by hands that lived millennia before the compass, the sextant, or the clock. One tablet, unearthed in the ruins of Uruk, explicitly names celestial bodies in motion, describing their paths with accuracy that modern astronomers didn't match until centuries after Galileo. Were they guessing? Copying from someone else? Or was there something someone passing that knowledge down. Even more disturbing are the consistencies. Across hundreds of sites, across centuries of reigns and rulers. The Anunnaki narrative doesn't fade. It persists, it evolves, but never disappears. In tablets discovered in Eridu, one of Sumer's oldest cities, the story is the same. Beings who descended from the heavens taught writing, measurement, agriculture, not metaphorically, functionally, tools, techniques, laws. In the later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, the names shift slightly. The emphasis changes, but the essence remains intact. These sky visitors didn't come once. They stayed. They interfered. They judged. They fought among themselves, and most tellingly, they eventually left. That departure, the return to the heavens, is documented too. Not celebrated, not lamented, just noted, like any other event in a ledger. What kind of culture documents gods with such neutrality? And then there are the flood stories. Dozens of tablets, separated by time, distance, and dialect, mention a catastrophic deluge sent by angry gods to wipe out humanity. One figure survives. He's warned ahead of time. He builds a vessel, he escapes. It sounds biblical. But this version predates Genesis by over 1,000 years. The survivor's name isn't Noah. It's Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim. Different names, same pattern. Even the reasons for the flood are eerily specific. Humanity had grown too noisy, too chaotic, too independent. One of the gods wanted silence, the other wanted mercy. And it was Enki, the friendly Anunnaki, who saved humanity. The parallels aren't subtle. They're foundational, and they raise a question we can't avoid. If the Sumerians made it all up, why did so many cultures copy the same myth, detail for detail? Consider this. When later civilizations like the Babylonians, Assyrians, even the early Hebrews adapted these stories, they didn't start from scratch. They borrowed from tablets already ancient in their time. This means the core myths of sky beings, floods, and forbidden knowledge go back not just thousands, but tens of thousands of years in oral tradition. Are we looking at symbols or echoes? Misremembered encounters? Could it be that humanity's earliest stories aren't fiction, but history distorted by time? And if so, what kind of history begins not on Earth, but with descent from the stars? Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Ulika. These weren't just early cities. They were capitals of something far more complex. The Sumerians didn't view their settlements as isolated tribes or kingdoms. They saw them as assigned domains, each under the watch of a specific Anunnaki. In tablet after tablet, we see the same pattern. Divine appointment, sacred duty, civic planning. Enki ruled Eridu, the city of wisdom and water. Inanna presided over Uruk, a city of fertility, love, and fierce independence. Nippur was the domain of Enlil, god of wind, judgment, and kingship. These weren't arbitrary associations. They were recorded with legalistic precision. Why would a civilization obsessed with astronomy and geometry treat gods like bureaucrats? Why give them jurisdictions, temples, rituals, and job descriptions? Each city had a ziggurat, a step pyramid temple said to connect Earth with the heavens. Not metaphorically, literally. The Sumerians called them Ekur, meaning mountain house, a bridge between worlds. Priests ascended the ziggurats not for symbolism, but for communion. Some tablets even describe sky boats landing atop them, vehicles ferrying the gods between their heavenly abode and earthly seats of power. Again, this isn't poetry. These accounts come from administrative texts, economic records, and ritual inventories. Some include notations for when the gods arrived, complete with dates in lunar calendars. Why track the movements of myths like cargo shipments? Consider the city of Uruk, arguably the first metropolis in human history. It had a massive wall, a bustling port, and a population in the tens of thousands. Its patron deity was Inanna, goddess of war and love, often depicted in winged form with rays emanating from her shoulders. Her arrival was marked by festivals, processions, and sacrifices, but also by calendar shifts. The city's entire agricultural and civic schedule adjusted to align with the celestial timing of her descent. Why structure a calendar around the visit of a symbolic figure? Why change farming patterns, temple offerings, and construction dates to match stories, unless those stories were based on observable events? The deeper we look, the harder it becomes to dismiss. These gods didn't float vaguely through myth. They lived in temples, issued decrees, punished disobedience. Their influence wasn't spiritual, it was legislative. Some tablets even detail court disputes where a ruling was issued in the name of Enlil, or by command of Enki. Imagine divine arbitration being cited in property law. Either the Sumerians invented the idea of legally active gods with unprecedented bureaucratic precision, or they were documenting a theocratic system run by real individuals elevated to godlike status. The line between mythology and administration becomes disturbingly thin. When we speak of ancient gods, most think of thunderbolts and miracles. But the Anunnaki aren't depicted performing miracles. They govern, they manage, they punish through floods, not fire. They bless through irrigation, not magic. Enki, for instance, is credited with teaching humans how to dig canals, build levees, and store water. Tasks modern civil engineers would recognize. These aren't metaphors. Archaeological surveys show that Sumerian irrigation systems were centuries ahead of their time, with aqueducts, sluice gates, and drainage basins. These technologies appear suddenly, fully formed. No slow development, no learning curve, just execution. Just as the tablets described, the knowledge was delivered. The city of Nippur was more than a religious center. It was the geopolitical core of Sumer. Enlil's temple, the Akur, was the de facto seat of divine authority. No king ruled Sumer without first receiving Enlil's blessing. This ritual wasn't optional. It was binding. The king would undergo a symbolic marriage to a deity, usually Inanna, to legitimize his reign. But here's the twist. This wasn't purely spiritual. In some cases, actual priestesses performed the role of the goddess, engaging in elaborate ceremonies that included contracts, feasting, and even consummation. What civilization invents divine legitimacy as a transactional, almost corporate process? And then there's Lagash, governed under the watch of Ningirsu, the god of war and farming. This duality, military strength and agricultural abundance, reflects a practical approach to theology. The Anunnaki were assigned where their traits matched the needs of the city. These weren't omnipresent gods. They had addresses. They had functions. And when a city fell, the god's absence was noted, recorded, sometimes even lamented in hymns as though a ruler had left office. We have documents listing temple inventories signed by scribes of Enlil, and court records resolving disputes under Namu's edicts. No thunder, walang halos, just paperwork. What emerges is a portrait not of mythology, but of occupation. Divine beings appointed to oversee specific zones, teach specific skills, and enforce specific laws. It's eerily similar to modern systems of governance. Zones of control, chain of command, code enforcement. Except these governors weren't elected, they descended. And when they left, collapse followed. Cities fell, calendars ended, rulers died. And always, the departure is recorded with the same phrase. They returned to the stars. Not died, not disappeared. Returned, a logistical term, a departure, not an ending. Which leads us to ask, if these figures were never born, never died, and always arrived from and returned to the sky, what exactly were they? Gods, symbols, or something else entirely? Scattered across Mesopotamia, archaeologists uncovered tablets not of mythology, but of measurement. Grids, angles, ratios. These weren't just blueprints. They were blueprints centuries too advanced. The temples they built aligned with solstices. The ziggurats faced cardinal directions with uncanny precision. Even the placement of city walls followed astronomical markers. The Sumerians didn't merely build, they calibrated. They calculated star risings and planetary cycles to time harvests, religious rituals, even bricklaying. This wasn't astrology, it was engineering. And the texts credit their knowledge not to observation, but to instruction from beings who descended from the sky. One tablet from Sippar describes a lesson between the god Utu and a priest engineer. Utu provides measurements for a temple foundation, specifying lengths down to fractional cubits. Another outlines ratios used for canal slopes, suggesting knowledge of fluid dynamics millennia ahead of its time. These aren't religious hymns, they're construction manuals. But the most curious detail lies not in what they measured, but what they mapped. Some tablets depict star constellations invisible to the naked eye. Others reference planets only officially discovered in the modern era. Uranus, Neptune, even Pluto, all marked, all named, all placed correctly. How could a Bronze Age civilization with no telescopes map a solar system they couldn't possibly see? The academic response: symbolism. But symbolism doesn't explain orbital paths or retrograde motion. It doesn't explain lunar eclipses plotted 400 years in advance. Some researchers suggest these were inherited charts, passed down from a lost civilization. But the tablets themselves refute this. They say plainly, the gods taught us, not the elders, not the ancestors. The gods. Enki taught geometry. Inanna taught calendars. Utu taught light and time. If this is invention, it's a coordinated one across cities, rulers, and generations. Always the same names, always the same claims. And then there's the temple plans. In Eridu, excavators found foundation stones with strange grooves, non-functional, precisely carved, arranged in repeating sequences. Some theorists believe these were harmonic alignments, like acoustic resonators. Others see magnetic patterns. The texts simply say the gods walked here and demanded the earth be prepared. Prepared how? For what? The architectural language mimics modern site planning, load distribution, stress mitigation, even energy dispersion. Again, how? How did farmers with clay tablets conceive of resonance chambers? Unless they didn't conceive them at all, unless they were following directions. In Nippur, a series of stone artifacts called foundation pegs were discovered beneath ancient temples. These weren't for support. They were symbolic, stamped with images of gods, tablets, and sometimes mysterious instruments held in the gods' hands. These instruments weren't spears or scrolls. They resembled tools, measuring rods, styluses with calibrations, even devices shaped like compasses. Sumerian texts refer to these objects as mi, a term loosely translated as divine decrees. But what if mi weren't just laws? What if they were literal specifications, codes for civilization? Each mi described a specific domain of knowledge. Truth, construction, metalwork, agriculture, and even radiance. Not metaphorical enlightenment, but actual physical light. Some inscriptions detail the brightness of the gods and radiant lines drawn in the heavens. Were these poetic flourishes? Or were they primitive attempts to describe something more technological? Illumination, energy, radiation? Ancient temples were said to hum with divine presence. Their inner sanctums restricted only to high priests, with rituals mimicking what sounds eerily like calibration or activation ceremonies. The gods didn't just reside, they dwelled in frequency. That phrase appears multiple times in tablets from Uruk and Lagash. Another fascinating pattern. These temple cities weren't scattered randomly. They formed geometric patterns when mapped across the Mesopotamian plain. Triangles, axes, radial lines, all emerging from key ziggurats. If accidental, it's the most statistically unlikely accident in ancient planning. If deliberate, it suggests aerial perspective, an impossible viewpoint for ancient builders, unless they had help, unless the designs were handed down from above, then followed with obsessive precision. Even the bricks bore markings, each batch logged, numbered, and matched to a schematic. The gods, the tablets claimed, demanded alignment with the sky. Modern scholars dismiss this as religious ritual, but nothing in the record suggests offerings or prayer during construction. Instead, it reads like compliance, checklists, sequences, recalibrations. An operation. Even more startling, when Sumerian temple layouts are overlaid with certain constellations from 3000 BC, they align with alarming consistency. Orion, Pleiades, the ecliptic. This wasn't random. It was mapped, tied to time, connected to the sky with a level of precision we wouldn't see again until the Renaissance. And according to the tablets, none of it was invented. It was all inherited, given, taught. So the question remains, taught by whom? And more disturbingly, taught for what purpose? Among the oldest surviving Sumerian tablets lies a chilling story, a flood not of myth, but of policy. Known as the Eridu Genesis, it predates the biblical Noah by over 1,000 years. It tells of Enlil, displeased with humanity's noise, chaos, and disobedience. His solution was not war, it was silence. A flood so vast, so total, it would erase not just people, but memory. Entire cities submerged, temples abandoned, knowledge reset. But one god resisted. Enki, the trickster engineer, defied the council. He whispered warnings to Ziusudra, a mortal priest king, not with magic, but with blueprints. Instructions to build a vessel, not a boat, but a structure designed to withstand the onslaught. Archaeologists once dismissed this as myth. Then came the discoveries. Deep layers of silt in cities like Shuruppak and Ur. A consistent flood stratum dated around 2900 BC, coinciding perfectly with the tablet's narrative. Coincidence? Or confirmation? Sumerian flood accounts don't just match the Bible, they precede it, with more technical detail. The vessel Enki designs is measured in cubits, described with multiple decks and waterproofing techniques. And the flood itself? Not divine magic, but the waters of the deep and the skies combined. A rare but geologically possible superflood event triggered by tectonic and meteorological forces. This wasn't fantasy. It was engineering under pressure. But what's more intriguing than the flood itself is what followed. According to the tablets, after the waters receded, the Anunnaki descended again, re-established temples, and reallocated the Me. A system reboot. Not a random survival story, but a coordinated restoration. Specific cities were rebuilt, specific leaders were chosen, specific knowledge was returned. Why? If the goal was total erasure, why the selective preservation? And who decides what knowledge survives a global reset? Ancient cities like Eridu and Kish contain rebuilt layers, temples constructed atop older ruins matching exactly the previous layout. The foundation pegs in these newer temples mirror their predecessors to the cubit. This wasn't improvisation. It was reconstruction based on archived specifications. Almost like someone had the master plan. Someone who knew what needed to be preserved and where it must be placed. And the survivors? They weren't just random people clinging to driftwood. They were priest kings, engineers, scribes, curators of civilization, chosen, prepared. The flood wasn't just a reset, it was a filter. The texts describe it as the Great Cleansing, but they also emphasize what was preserved. The divine decrees, the city plans, the astronomical charts. In temple after temple, archaeologists have unearthed post-flood tablets that begin not with creation, but with restoration. The gods returned, the rites reinstated, the stars repositioned. These aren't origin myths, they're operational logs, a civilization rebooted under supervision. And the most mysterious detail? The survivors didn't just rebuild, they built better. Stronger irrigation, more precise ziggurats, enhanced measurement tools. It's as if they had not just memories of the past, but improvements ready for deployment. One particular post-flood site, the city of Kish, contains an archive unlike any other. Tablets unearthed there show not mythology, but inventory. Lists of tools, schematic notations, materials transported from specific quarries hundreds of miles away. Who was organizing this? Who had the foresight to stockpile resources across the region before the catastrophe struck? And more importantly, how did they know where to place everything once it was over? The gods, the tablets say, gave instructions. But even if we strip away divinity, what remains is intent, design, oversight. And consider this. The Sumerians weren't the only culture with this flood narrative. The Akkadians, Babylonians, even distant Mesoamerican tribes share eerily similar stories of floods, chosen survivors, and celestial teachers. Why this global obsession with deluge? Mainstream scholars argue for archetypes, universal symbols of chaos and renewal. But symbols don't leave sediment layers. They don't encode engineering diagrams into flood myths. And they don't explain the global synchronicity in timelines. Around 2900 to 3000 BC, dozens of civilizations either vanish or undergo massive restructuring. Temples rebuilt, languages refined, knowledge reintroduced. Was this coincidence or coordination? The more we uncover, the clearer the pattern becomes. The flood wasn't a metaphor, it was an event. And what followed wasn't random survival, it was structured revival. Not everyone was meant to live, only those with function. Scribes, builders, astronomers, the keepers of memory. If the Anunnaki myth holds any truth, even symbolically, it paints a disturbing picture. A world curated from above, wiped clean when noisy, restored when obedient. That's not just theology, it's control. Scripted collapse, managed continuity. Which leads to the ultimate question. If it happened once, could it happen again? Long before telescopes or satellites, the Sumerians were already tracking the heavens with a level of detail that continues to puzzle astronomers today. Their clay tablets contain lunar cycles, planetary motions, even predictions of eclipses, calculated with such precision that some align almost perfectly with modern astronomical data. The question is, how? with what tools, and guided by whom. These weren't isolated observations. They were systemic, coordinated, preserved for generations. The most famous of these records, the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, charts the movements of Venus over 21 years. But this wasn't astronomy for curiosity. It was strategy. Their calendar regulated agriculture, religious rituals, construction, even warfare. Why Venus? Because it's the only planet visible as both morning and evening star, appearing to rise and disappear unpredictably. To track it accurately, one needs longitudinal consistency, mathematical literacy, and deep familiarity with orbital mechanics. The Sumerians had all three. Their numerical system was sexagesimal, based on 60, not 10. 60 divides evenly into so many parts, it's ideal for angular measurements, time, and astronomy. That's why we still divide hours, minutes, and degrees the way we do today. But here's the enigma. No culture before them used this system. It appears in their records suddenly, fully formed. No gradual evolution, no primitive drafts, just precision. Equally puzzling is their alignment of temples and ziggurats with solstices, equinoxes, and star clusters like Pleiades and Orion. These structures weren't built randomly. Their entrances, shadows, and axial lines mark celestial transitions. How did they achieve this alignment without compasses or modern optics? The tablets describe the gods as those who fix the stars in place, and claim the rites of measurement were taught by the lords of the firmament. Even if metaphorical, the symbolism implies knowledge passed down, not developed independently. More than that, it suggests the knowledge was meant to be preserved, encoded in stone and ritual, to outlast floods, wars, even the collapse of empires. In cities like Ur and Nippur, archaeologists found gnomons, vertical pillars used to track the sun's shadow across the year. But surrounding these were concentric rings carved with intervals, possibly early sundials, maybe observatories. In Nippur, a city dedicated to the god Enlil, the temple's foundation aligns almost perfectly with the celestial pole of 4000 BC. This alignment no longer holds today, due to axial precession, yet their layout matches that ancient orientation. To achieve this, one must have tracked stars for centuries, accounting for the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a phenomenon supposedly discovered in the West only in the 2nd century BC. So who or what gave them this knowledge? If it was purely human effort, why do their records insist on divine transmission? Why encode astronomy into myth? Why insist that the skies were read, not just observed? These weren't passive star watchers. They were calibrators, engineers of time. And if their myths contain even fragments of memory, of teachers from above, then perhaps the Sumerian calendar wasn't invented at all. Perhaps it was received. In many ancient cultures, time was myth, circular, intuitive, based on seasons, harvests, and omens. But for the Sumerians, time was architecture, measured, modular, sacred. Their calendar wasn't just agricultural, it was celestial. It synchronized solar years with lunar months using intercalary months, inserted regularly to avoid drift. This sophistication rivals the later Babylonian and even Julian systems. But again, the puzzle isn't just what they did. It's how early they did it. No other culture from 3000 BC had a working lunisolar calendar this accurate. So where did this knowledge come from? One Sumerian tablet attributes the method to Enki, lord of fresh waters and wisdom, who set the time of the moon's turning. Some might call that mythology. But what if it's a memory of instruction? Sumerian priest astronomers, called Umu, were not mere scribes. They were initiates, trained to observe, record, calculate, and align civic life with celestial rhythms. Their temples weren't just places of worship, they were data centers. Ziggurats functioned as observatories, their upper tiers reserved for sky watching and lunar observations. In fact, several tablets outline duties that sound eerily like modern scientific protocols: recording rise and set times, measuring shadow lengths, documenting anomalies. It's less like folklore and more like a program. One text, Enuma Anu Enlil, catalogs over 7,000 omens based on astronomical phenomena. But they're not random superstitions. Each is tied to political outcomes, harvest yields, or weather patterns. The implication? Correlation. Maybe even early causation models. This was predictive modeling 4,000 years ago. And remarkably, modern studies have found statistical alignment between some of these omens and actual climatic cycles, suggesting the Sumerians may have detected periodicities we're only now confirming with satellites. That level of observation doesn't come from stargazing alone. It comes from sustained data collection by generations of specialists trained for a task. Even the Sumerian myths hint at knowledge transfer from beyond. One poem describes 7 sages arriving from the sea, bearing knowledge of stars, farming, and writing. They wore fish garments. Their eyes were luminous. Scholars label this as symbolism, gods of culture emerging from the deep. But the Sumerians recorded their appearance as a historical episode. Specific locations, sequence of arrival, named individuals. They didn't float through clouds. They walked, spoke, taught. And when their work was done, they departed. Not ascended, departed. What kind of visitors wear elaborate suits, emit light, and leave behind systems still in use millennia later? Even if symbolic, the resonance is chilling. The knowledge they imparted didn't just help the Sumerians survive. It helped them predict, build, and rule. Their calendar was not a spiritual abstraction. It was a control mechanism, one that linked cosmic motion to daily governance. It enforced ritual timing, agricultural cycles, tax schedules, war campaigns. Time was not passive. It was a command, and the Sumerians obeyed, not because they believed blindly, but because it worked. The Anunnaki weren't silent deities lingering in the shadows. In the Sumerian records, they were direct actors, manipulating weather, waging disputes, engineering life. One of the most cryptic stories comes from the tale of Enki and Ninmah, where divine beings collaborate to create humanity. At first glance, it's a creation myth like many others. But a closer reading reveals something else entirely. Descriptions that suggest experimentation. The gods mold humans from clay, mixed with divine essence. Early versions fail. One cannot speak, another is blind, one urinates constantly. These aren't mystical images. They're lab trial failures, biological, defects described through the lens of a Bronze Age vocabulary. Eventually, a viable model is made, and this version is kept. The story then shifts, warning that humans must remain dependent, never equal. The Anunnaki create us not as companions, but as laborers, to bear burdens, to irrigate fields and worship. The implications are unsettling. In this account, we are not children of the gods. We are their workforce, born from trials, approved by consensus. Even the Sumerians recorded moral discomfort. Enki disagrees with the severity of humanity's role, while Enlil becomes increasingly authoritarian. Floods are sent, cities are destroyed. Dissent among the Anunnaki themselves becomes central. These beings weren't uniform. They had hierarchy, bias, even ideological divisions. One flood myth mirrors this tension with eerie precision. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity becomes too noisy. Enlil decides to exterminate them with a great deluge. But Enki, compassionate and pragmatic, warns a chosen human. This is not a vague tale. The hero is given detailed building instructions, measurements, materials. The instructions for the boat are eerily similar to those found in Mesopotamian architecture. Is this merely coincidence? Or is it a distorted memory of survival and rescue, preserved under layers of symbolic language? The notion of gods shaping life and later regretting it isn't unique to Sumer. But nowhere else is it so procedural, so mechanical. The Sumerians weren't describing ethereal forces. They outlined events with causal steps, mixing blood, clay, and breath, choosing wombs, waiting for gestation. The process may be allegorical, but the level of detail raises difficult questions. Could these stories preserve memories of something akin to genetic manipulation? Something the Sumerians could not understand directly, but recorded the best they could. Ancient astronaut theorists leap to DNA engineering, but a more grounded possibility remains: the transmission of advanced reproductive or medical knowledge by a culture far ahead of its time. The deeper puzzle isn't just what these myths say, but how consistently they say it. Across different cities, time periods, and dialects, the core themes remain. Sky beings descending, conflict among them, human creation through effort and error. The Sumerians were too structured, too consistent for this to be random invention. Their stories form a pattern, not a patchwork. They depict a species formed for utility, given language and law, but always under watch, always inferior. So who were the Anunnaki? Literal visitors? Mythologized elites? Or something entirely lost to history? Their fingerprints remain on our oldest systems: law, agriculture, measurement, timekeeping. If they were fiction, they were the most influential fiction ever conceived. If they were real, we have yet to grasp their full impact. One of the most haunting aspects of the Anunnaki myths isn't just their involvement in humanity's birth, but their sudden decision to almost end it. In the Sumerian flood narratives, the gods do not act out of love or justice. They act out of frustration. Humanity is too noisy, too chaotic. The solution isn't discipline, it's extinction. The Anunnaki Council convenes. A flood is planned. Records state that even the gods were afraid of the storm they had created. This line carries enormous weight. The creators lost control of their creation and feared the consequences. That level of remorse doesn't align with pure mythology. It sounds like memory, the kind of cultural trauma passed down through generations as sacred warning. Enki's rebellion becomes the moral center of the tale. He breaks the oath of silence, instructs a chosen human to build a vessel, and saves life. His act isn't just heroic, it's subversive. He defies the hierarchy of his own kind. That choice echoes across civilizations: Noah, Menu, Utnapishtim. Different names, same pattern. A global memory of survival, betrayal, and transmission. Because what happens after the flood is just as important. Enki reintroduces knowledge. Agriculture resumes. Laws are given. Cities are rebuilt. It's a reset. And each reset begins with guidance from above. Another story, the myth of Adapa, offers more unsettling clues. Adapa, a semi-divine human, is summoned to heaven after angering a god. He's offered food and drink, but warned by Enki not to accept them. Adapa obeys. Later, he learns the food would have granted him immortality. The moral: humanity was given wisdom, but denied eternal life. Deliberately, and by the very beings who shaped them. Again, the theme is not benevolence, it's control. These stories don't depict loving creators, they portray rulers managing risk. Humanity, in their view, must remain dependent, mortal, grateful. So how do we read this? Are we interpreting ancient dreams or misunderstood records of actual power dynamics? Consider the iconography. Countless cylinder seals show towering figures standing over humans. Not metaphorically taller, physically larger. Some seals depict tools, rotas, bags, even wrist devices. These aren't mystical auras. They're objects, carved with care, measured with precision, and they recur over and over. In Ur, Lagash, Nippur, that consistency implies more than imagination. It suggests memory, and memory implies experience. Then there's the technological aspect. Sumerian tablets describe not only farming tools and water systems, but medical procedures, surgical instruments, and healing rituals involving chemicals we can identify today. Opium, antiseptics, salicylic acid, and all of it is attributed to divine instruction. That's not poetic, that's attribution. Ancient doctors called themselves servants of Enki. Temples doubled as hospitals. Knowledge was not discovered, it was received. This belief system shaped Sumerian governance. Kings were not absolute. They ruled by the mandate of the gods, often delivered through oracles or dreams. And when rulers defied divine law, calamity followed. Flood, famine, rebellion. This wasn't superstition, it was system. A controlled social structure reinforced by myths of origin and threat. Humanity's role, obedience, worship, production. The gods gave, but they also watched. Were the Anunnaki real? That depends on your definition. If real means historical elites mythologized into legend, the evidence supports that. If real means something more, visitors, transmitters of knowledge, the door remains open. Because the Sumerians, the world's first historians, said it plainly. They came from the sky. In a dusty museum drawer in Berlin lies a small artifact that continues to baffle scholars. A cylinder seal cataloged as VA 243. Barely the size of a matchbox, this ancient piece of carved stone shows a scene that shouldn't exist. Among the cuneiform inscriptions and seated figures is a clear, unmistakable depiction of the solar system. A central sphere surrounded by 11 orbiting bodies. Not stars, not abstract symbols. Planets, accurately placed, proportioned, and numbered. What's more, the scale suggests awareness of planets invisible to the naked eye. Uranus, Neptune, even Pluto. How could this be? Mainstream archaeology dismisses this interpretation, attributing the image to symbolic motifs or misidentified stars. But the image itself remains. Not a single sphere. 12. In Sumerian cosmology, Earth is not the third planet, but the seventh. Why? Because their count began beyond Pluto, with a mysterious planet called Nibiru. A planet they claimed intersected our solar system on a vast elliptical orbit. A celestial body that brought the Anunnaki with it. According to their texts, this wasn't myth. It was history. Modern astronomers scoff. There's no confirmed Planet X in our system. But as recently as 2016, several astrophysicists reignited the debate by suggesting a distant, massive object might exist beyond Neptune, exerting unexplained gravitational effects. Suddenly, the notion of a hidden planet wasn't pseudoscience. It was plausible. And the Sumerians knew it thousands of years ago. Even if they were wrong, how did they construct such an accurate cosmic model? The seal shows planetary alignment, orbital positions, not poetic metaphors, but astronomical data. Elsewhere, tablets describe constellations with shocking familiarity. The Sumerians didn't just observe the stars, they charted them. The zodiac, later attributed to Babylonian astrology, began here. Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, constellations we still name today, originated in ancient Mesopotamia. One star map, the MULAPIN, lists over 70 celestial objects and their seasonal positions. These weren't vague approximations. They formed calendars, guided planting, regulated festivals. The stars weren't decoration, they were tools. The Sumerians also tracked lunar and solar eclipses. Milwan tablet even records the Saros cycle, the 18-year rhythm modern astronomers still use to predict eclipses. Again, without telescopes, without computers, just observation or memory of something more. Because what puzzles historians isn't just the precision, but the timing. Sumerian civilization arose around 4,500 BC. Their advanced astronomy appears fully formed. No long evolution, no crude early charts, just perfection, as if the knowledge arrived, complete. And the gods they credit are always the same: Enki, Enlil, Anu, not poetically, by name, with roles. Enki gives mathematical knowledge. Enlil teaches seasonal cycles. The tablets don't say, "we discovered." They say, "we were taught." That phrasing matters. These weren't discoveries. They were transmissions. To the Sumerians, the stars didn't just shine, they spoke. Their gods weren't just worshipped. They were consulted, calculated, obeyed. So what do we make of it? Is it all allegory? Lucky guesses? Or faint memories of real instruction delivered by a source no longer remembered, except in stone and clay? When skeptics argue that ancient people could have tracked the stars through simple naked-eye observation, they miss the deeper question. Not whether observation is possible, but how such sophisticated conclusions emerge so early and so rapidly. Most civilizations evolve astronomy incrementally. The Sumerians arrived on the historical stage with a complete system. Their mathematical models, timekeeping, and cosmological structures appeared together, not in fragments. That sudden emergence breaks pattern. It suggests inheritance or intervention. Let's examine time itself. Our 60-minute hour, 360-degree circle, and 24-hour day all descend from Sumerian math. Their base 60 system, sexagesimal, wasn't just arbitrary. It allowed for complex fractions, easy divisibility, and precise timekeeping. But why base 60? It's not intuitive, not for trade, not for farming. It's optimal for calculation. It's ideal for astronomy. And it's still in use today. The Sumerians didn't just invent numbers, they embedded them in the structure of reality. Their calendars synchronized lunar and solar cycles, accounting for leap years, solstices, and even planetary retrogrades. Some of their festival dates still align with equinoxes and celestial events. All this from a culture supposedly lacking telescopes, compasses, or advanced instruments. Either they achieved brilliance through patience, or they were shown a framework, then perfected it. And again, the texts are clear. Given by the gods, not discovered. Revealed? A 3,500-year-old tablet known as the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa contains precise observations of Venus over 21 years. Modern astronomers who reverse-engineered the data found it stunningly accurate. The Sumerians had not only identified Venus as both the morning and evening star, they tracked its synodic cycle, accounting for irregularities caused by Earth's own movement. This wasn't stargazing, this was science. In one Sumerian temple, archaeologists found wall carvings resembling gear mechanisms, circular symbols with teeth aligned with star diagrams, primitive orreries, models of the heavens. Their purpose is still unknown. But their design is precise, symmetrical, mathematical. Nothing decorative, everything functional. Even Sumerian architecture reflected celestial alignment. Ziggurats often faced cardinal directions, aligning with solstice sunrises or equinox points. Shadows from their corners marked seasonal changes. Some temples had open roofs, possibly for observing stellar transitions. These weren't just holy sites. They were observatories. Embedded in religious life, science thrived under spiritual guise. And the gods who received this devotion were the same ones credited with knowledge itself. Now consider myth. The Anunnaki descend from the heavens, but not once, repeatedly. They come, teach, retreat. They return. Their heaven isn't vague. It's described with direction, duration, purpose. Some texts even describe heavenly boats arriving in flames, creating tremors. Could this be symbolic? Of course. But so are all memories, shaped by culture, preserved by metaphor. That doesn't make them fiction. Mainstream historians urge caution, and rightly so. We cannot claim aliens built civilization, but we must also resist the reflex to dismiss ancient voices simply because they contradict modern assumptions. The Sumerians left us more than myths. They left records, mathematical, astronomical, architectural. The oldest library in the world wasn't built by accident. Its tablets weren't written as fantasy. They were written as truth, as the Sumerians understood it. So the question remains, did they reach the stars alone? Or were they shown the map? Long before the Sumerians carved their star maps and spoke of gods from the heavens, there may have been another, a civilization older, forgotten, and possibly erased by time. This theory, whispered at the edges of mainstream archaeology, suggests that the knowledge credited to the Sumerians was not entirely theirs. Instead, they inherited it from a much earlier people whose existence survives only in fragments, in anomalous artifacts, and in persistent myths that refuse to fade. If true, it would rewrite the very foundations of human history. The most compelling evidence begins not in Mesopotamia, but in modern-day Turkey. There, atop a barren plateau, stands Göbekli Tepe, an archaeological site that stunned the world. Discovered in the 1990s, its circular stone structures and towering T-shaped pillars date back to 9,600 BC. Over 6,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and nearly 7,000 years before the first Sumerian city-states. The stones are carved with intricate animal reliefs and astronomical symbols. The scale and precision suggest planning, engineering, and a sophisticated spiritual worldview. But who built it? Mainstream explanations say early hunter-gatherers, yet no tools, no farming settlements, no signs of gradual development accompany the site. Göbekli Tepe appears like a flash, fully formed, then deliberately buried. A complex sanctuary raised by a culture that official history says shouldn't have existed. Its sudden emergence mirrors the Sumerian dilemma, knowledge appearing out of sequence. Could the builders of Göbekli Tepe have been a lost civilization, one that passed on fragments of knowledge to later cultures? Consider the continuity. Both sites display celestial alignments. Both use advanced masonry. Both embed meaning into architecture. And both speak, symbolically or directly, of guidance from above. Even Sumerian texts hint at predecessors. They speak of kingship descending from heaven before the Great Flood, of antediluvian cities ruled by gods and sages. These were not allegories of divine rule. They were chronological records, complete with names, reign lengths, and city origins. One king, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Absurd, perhaps, or perhaps symbolic of memory stretched across generations. Other clues surface globally. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, shows Antarctica beneath its current ice sheet, something only possible with knowledge predating the last ice age. Advanced ruins like Pumapunku in Bolivia defy construction methods available to their time. These out-of-place artifacts suggest a civilization that spanned continents, shared knowledge, and vanished, leaving only echoes. If the Sumerians received inherited wisdom, how was it preserved? Oral tradition, carved tablets, astronomical rituals encoded in temples and ceremonies, all are possible. Ancient cultures often masked science within myth, encrypting knowledge in stories. And when the carriers of that knowledge fell, only fragments remained, misinterpreted by time or mistaken for religion. What we're left with is not a conspiracy, but a gap, a missing chapter. The precision of Sumerian science, the sudden rise of structured society, the uncanny celestial charts, all point to something behind the curtain, a source unnamed, unseen, but not entirely lost. If this lost civilization theory holds even a grain of truth, the implications are staggering. It suggests that human history isn't linear, but cyclical, rising, collapsing, and rising again. That pockets of advanced knowledge once flourished in isolated corners of the ancient world, only to be erased by cataclysm or time. Some scholars point to global flood myths as evidence. Found in over 200 cultures, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, they describe a great deluge wiping out an earlier age. The Sumerians wrote of it. So did the Hebrews, the Hindus, the Greeks, and the indigenous peoples of the Andes. But what if these weren't just metaphors? What if these myths preserve a shared trauma, one so massive it fractured human progress? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis posits that around 10,800 BC, a comet or fragment struck Earth, triggering massive climate shifts, floods, and extinctions. Sea levels rose dramatically. Coastal cities, if they existed, would have been submerged. Civilizations depending on stable climates would have vanished. What remains would be fragments, carried in memory, scattered across survivors, later reborn as myth. Sumer may have inherited this legacy. Not the cities or buildings, but the blueprint, encoded in ritual, preserved through migration, reinterpreted over time as divine revelation. Now imagine being among the first Sumerian scribes, hearing tales from elders about the ones who came before, about shining towers swallowed by water, about men who mapped the skies, knew the secrets of metal, who walked with gods. You wouldn't see them as ancestors. You'd see them as deities, as the Anunnaki. This shifts the interpretation. The Anunnaki may not have been extraterrestrials at all, but humans. Survivors of a prior civilization, appearing to the early Sumerians as gods because of their knowledge, their tools, their memory. Just as an iPhone would seem divine in the hands of a 10th century peasant, the remnants of a prior age would appear miraculous to those starting anew. And in time, myth would do what it always does. It would grow. Take the myth of Enki teaching irrigation. We read it as a god helping mankind. But what if it was a displaced engineer carrying the last knowledge of canal systems? What if the divine gift of writing was the rediscovery of an older script? What if astronomy was not invention, but translation? We see this pattern elsewhere. In Egypt, Thoth is the god of wisdom, yet also credited with restoring forgotten knowledge. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl brings law and science. Always a bringer, never a creator. Always returning, never originating. This archetype of the returning teacher echoes globally. It doesn't speak of myth. It speaks of memory. So perhaps the Anunnaki aren't aliens. Perhaps they're echoes. Human, fallible, powerful but lost. And their stories, preserved by the Sumerians, are the last faint signal of a civilization long buried under time and sand. Until we find their ruins, beneath deserts, beneath oceans, we have only these tablets and the mystery they whisper. What if mythology is just misremembered history, distorted by time, ritual, and repetition? When we strip away the divine glow from the Sumerian tablets, what remains may be something colder, more plausible, and perhaps more unsettling. The possibility that the Anunnaki were real people, real teachers, who became gods in the minds of those they helped. This doesn't require flying saucers or fantasy, just memory, and the way humans turn memory into myth when words fail and generations pass. History shows this pattern clearly. In every civilization, great men become demigods, teachers become prophets, and leaders become legends. Gilgamesh, once a mortal king, became a hero who defied death. Pharaohs became living gods. Sumer may have done the same, elevating a group of ancient sages into skyborn immortals. It's not hard to see how this happens. Picture early Sumerians discovering a ruined ziggurat or stone observatory buried in sand, its purpose forgotten, its makers unknown. To them, it would seem built by gods. If a wandering survivor taught them celestial patterns or how to irrigate, their descendants wouldn't remember the engineer. They'd remember the miracle. They'd call him Enki. As memory fades, stories condense, and metaphor replaces fact. Over centuries, real events become epics. Names gain halos. Myths are born not from lies, but from loss. And as time marches forward, the line between memory and mythology vanishes. The Anunnaki, then, may not be fantasy, but memory encoded in legend. This interpretation opens another door. If the Anunnaki were not literal gods or extraterrestrials, but historical figures mythologized by cultural memory, what does that tell us about human development? It suggests that civilization is not linear, but recursive. That knowledge can be lost and refound. That humanity has already climbed the ladder of science and structure more than once. When Sumer spoke of kingship descending from heaven, they may have meant wisdom descending from a forgotten age, not divine intervention, but intellectual inheritance. And if so, our current era might not be the first to gaze into the stars and ask where we came from. The Sumerians might have done the same, using their myths as a mirror, reflecting both what they knew and what they had lost. This theory also reframes the Sumerian obsession with legacy. They weren't just documenting trade or recording floods. They were preserving fragments of something bigger. Their cuneiform tablets weren't simply administrative records. They were rescue operations, cultural life rafts carrying echoes of a lost world. When they carved stories of gods descending from the sky, of knowledge arriving suddenly, of golden ages and celestial teachers, they weren't inventing. They were transmitting, in code, in poetry, in clay. The Anunnaki may have been their last attempt to anchor a vanishing truth in something permanent. This brings us to the question, why is the Anunnaki narrative so persistent? Why do these names, Enki, Enlil, Anu, still echo in modern myth, alternative history, and pop culture? Because deep down, we sense a gap in our timeline. A blank space between hunter-gatherer simplicity and the sudden appearance of organized cities, math, astronomy, writing. The Sumerians filled that gap with stories of sky gods. We, millennia later, fill it with aliens or lost continents. But both are just masks for the same anxiety. We don't fully understand our own beginnings. The Anunnaki are not just figures from ancient texts. They are symbols of a question we haven't yet answered. And maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe ancient myths survive, not because they tell us what happened, but because they remind us that something did happen, something we've forgotten. Myth, then, becomes a warning, a map with missing coordinates. The Anunnaki represent a riddle carved into the foundation of civilization. Whether they were men, gods, or something in between doesn't matter as much as what they reveal. That history is layered, non-linear, and incomplete. That what we call the beginning may have been a reboot. That we may be walking over ruins older than our stories, repeating cycles we don't even recognize. So perhaps the real mystery isn't the Anunnaki. It's us. Why we remember what we remember. Why we forget what we forget. Why the sky still holds our gaze as if we're expecting someone or something to return. In the end, the question is not whether the Anunnaki existed, but whether we still carry their legacy in our bones, in our math, in our myths. And if so, what else lies buried, under sand, under water, under centuries of silence, waiting to remind us who we really are? If we accept that the Anunnaki were real, not as gods or aliens, but as memories encoded in myth, then a stranger idea emerges. What if the knowledge they brought wasn't supernatural, but rediscovered? What if they didn't descend from the stars, but from a civilization that had already climbed, collapsed, and vanished? In this view, the Anunnaki were not emissaries from other worlds. They were survivors, custodians of a forgotten order, passing down fragments of ancient understanding before it disappeared completely. Not saviors, but witnesses. The Sumerians, then, were not inventors of civilization, but inheritors of its ashes, rebuilding with borrowed blueprints. We know history isn't linear. It stutters, it falls. Civilizations rise, then vanish into sand or sea. Göbekli Tepe, built over 11,000 years ago, predates the wheel, agriculture, and writing. Yet, it shows astonishing complexity. The timeline no longer makes sense. How did people carve megaliths with no cities? Who taught them astronomy before telescopes? The pattern repeats across the globe. Pyramids in Egypt, solar alignments in Stonehenge, impossible ruins in Pumapunku. Always the same mystery. Too much knowledge, too early. The Anunnaki legend may be a cipher, not for gods, but for gaps. And the Sumerians might have been the first to try to decode them. That's what makes the story so compelling. The Anunnaki are not just relics of Sumerian belief. They are a mirror reflecting our own uncertainties. Every civilization invents origin myths, but few preserve them with the detail and consistency found in Mesopotamian tablets. That consistency matters. It suggests intent, urgency, purpose. These weren't bedtime stories. They were warning signs. And while modern historians dismiss them as poetic invention, the details continue to defy explanation. Astronomical data far ahead of its time. Mathematics we still use. Architectural precision rivaling our own. The deeper we look, the harder it is to dismiss. So where does that leave us? Maybe the Anunnaki weren't real beings, but the knowledge was. Maybe they weren't extraterrestrials, but something equally foreign. A lost chapter of human history. A pre-flood civilization, advanced and now forgotten, remembered only through fractured stories, symbols, and myths. To the Sumerians, the past wasn't distant. It was sacred. The Anunnaki weren't future gods. They were echoes. In clay, they preserved memory. And through those memories, a strange truth emerges. We may not be the first advanced humans to walk this earth. We may just be the most recent. There's a reason this theory keeps returning, why authors, filmmakers, and researchers continue chasing the Anunnaki. Not because it proves aliens, not because it solves history, but because it reveals a blind spot, an unspoken discomfort. The timeline doesn't add up. Humanity, as we know it, appeared abruptly. Cities exploded into existence. Astronomy was somehow ancient, and writing, math, and agriculture all surfaced together. Civilizations don't usually bloom overnight, unless they're being rebuilt, unless someone already had the blueprint. That's what the tablets whisper, not fantasy, not faith, but memory, encoded, poetic, imperfect, and persistent. The Anunnaki remind us of a deeper possibility, that truth may survive collapse, that knowledge can outlive its makers, that myths, when read with discernment, carry more than entertainment. They carry warnings. Every empire forgets it's not the first. Every age thinks it's original. But somewhere in our DNA, in our architecture, in our language, we may still carry fingerprints from another time. From builders we don't remember. From teachers we never met. So the next time you hear the name Anunnaki, don't ask, did they come from the stars? Ask instead, did we forget something we were never meant to forget? The past isn't gone, it's buried, waiting.